Hi, Moses. So I'm just making a response back to Louis Ruggerio's latest video on Romans 9 and Pharaoh. Asking the question, I guess, on this part, does Mr. Ruggerio refute unconditional election? Well, let's first start off by saying that Mr. Ruggerio is beating the air here because Romans 9:17 through 18 in particular does not teach unconditional election. Rather, what it does teach is reprobation. What you have to understand is when you get into Romans 9, when you look at the context, the unconditional election part was actually already dealt with in Romans 9, particularly verses 6 through 13. Starting in verse 14, Paul is now dealing with the objections that are going on to the doctrine of unconditional election. He says here, kind of anticipating objections that he's probably already heard from people in teaching this. He says, what shall we say then? Is there unrighteousness with God? That is, if God elects some people to salvation, as he did with Jacob, with Isaac, etc., how is it then that God is fair if the other people don't seem to have a chance because they're not picked? Okay, so there's the objection. God isn't being fair. Okay, is there unrighteousness with God? What does Paul say? Certainly not. Okay, he pulls out a couple of examples. One of them happens to be Pharaoh. But very quickly, I guess let me just point out here, what you need to understand is Mr. Ruggerio is not siding with Paul here. He's siding with the objector. Paul is the one saying, that no, God is not fair if he picks one person. And how does Paul prove that? Well, he quotes from Exodus 33:19, which says here, I will have mercy on whomever I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whomever I will have compassion. Essentially, in this verse, and what God is doing when he's speaking to Moses here in Exodus 33, is expressing his sovereignty, the freedom to show his grace and his mercy to whomever he chooses, not whomever somehow earns it or fulfills certain conditions for it, as Mr. Ruggerio would have us to believe. There's nothing like that in this text. And he goes on in verse 16, he says, so then it is not of him who wills or of him who runs, but of God who shows mercy. What is not of him who wills? God's mercy, God's compassion. God retains his sovereign freedom to give his mercy and his compassion, his grace essentially, to whomever he chooses. According to Mr. Ruggerio, it's conditional. Well, you have to have faith. You need to humble yourself. You need to fear the Lord, etc. There's none of that in the text. Okay, let me go over some points with the little time that I have left, because what Mr. Ruggerio brings up here is Romans 9:17 through 18, and I wanted to deal with those with some words from other Calvinists. One of them, whom he says he's read, and that is some words from Piper. I'm going to be taking some quotes from this very, very good work here. This is called "Chosen for Life: The Case for Divine Election." This is by Sam Storms. This is an excellent read, covering pretty much every objection and question about the doctrine of divine election. This is not a 5-point book. This is only about divine election. But he quotes here from Piper, which Mr. Ruggerio says that he's familiar with, but it doesn't sound like. He says this here. Paul now turns to his second illustration, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. We should begin by noting that God's hardening of Pharaoh's heart is not simply a judicial response to Pharaoh's self-hardening. Many contend that Pharaoh first freely hardened his own heart, and only then, as an act of judgment, did God harden his heart as well. This is based on the fact that in Exodus 8:15 and 8:32 it is said that Pharaoh hardened his heart, but not until 9:12 does it say that God hardened it. And basically Mr. Ruggerio takes us through this elaborate process of showing, well, see, God said he was going to do it, God said he was going to do it, God said he was going to do it, and God finally did it over here. Of course, if we read the scriptures that way, are we always going to be looking for the particular place where we find, where we see the explicit verse showing that God fulfilling what he said he was going to do? It's going to be pretty difficult to read the entire Bible that way if we're consistent with Mr. Ruggerio's exegetical methodology. Storms goes on to say, he says this, he says, but clearly, the hardening in 8:15 and 8:32 is simply the fulfillment of what God predicted he would do in Exodus 4:21. And I would add, really, it's the acknowledgement of the fulfillment of 4:21. And the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I have put in your power. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Pharaoh's resistance to God's commands in Exodus 5:2 is clearly the work of God, as Exodus 5:22 through 23 declares. Again, in Exodus 7:13, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and it says, as the Lord had said. That is the fulfillment of the prediction in 7:3 and 4 that God would harden his heart. Thus, those texts which say Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and those which say Pharaoh hardened his own heart, are simply fulfillments of God's declaration in 4:21 and in 7:3 of what he, that is God, would do. Now, from here we move on to the purpose, and Mr. Ruggiero has nothing at all to say about this. He doesn't even begin to address at all what Romans 9:17 says. The purpose for God's hardening Pharaoh's heart was in order that he might multiply his signs in the land of Egypt. Exodus 7:3 and 5. Again, in 14:3 and 4, God hardens Pharaoh's heart in order that he, that is God, might get glory over Pharaoh. God's intention in hardening Pharaoh's heart was so that there might be an extended occasion for the multiplication of God's signs and wonders. In this way, the name of God would be exalted, proclaimed, and magnified all the more. Dr. White, in his work, God's Sovereign Grace, this is an older one, I think he's renamed it, but I like what he says this. He says, we stop right here and say, wait a minute, I simply will not accept such a concept. My God is fair, and this God of whom you speak is most definitely not. But let's think closely about our feelings. First, we look at Pharaoh and say, poor fellow, God really mistreated him, but such is hardly the case. We feel like siding with Pharaoh because we share something in common with him. We are sinners, just as he is. We do our best to dismiss the fact that sinners have no claim on God's mercy. We forget that if God allows a sinner to exist for one instant after each and every act of sin, he is being gracious and merciful to them. And this is the theme of God's common grace that I'll get into in a little bit. And on an even more basic level, we hate the fact that God can do with us as he pleases, sinner or not. We are creatures, his creatures, and he can dispose of us as he pleases. If he wants Pharaoh to perform a certain function in bringing about a display of God's power, we have absolutely, positively no grounds upon which to complain. God is God, and we are not. Finally, the real question that must be asked of those who claim to be Christians is this: do we really feel that a display of God's power and the proclamation of his name, in short, the glory of God, is more or less important than a single individual human being? How important is the glory of God to us? If we are honest, we have to admit that God's glory is not the highest priority on our list. It should be. We must pray that God would make us like Christ in all ways, seeking his glory. And I would add, in effect, the effect of the hardening is not a weak one. In Exodus 14:17, as the Egyptians are chasing the Israelites, he says this. God says, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. Go in where? Go into the waters, into the parted waters. Now you have to think of the mentality here, okay? There's parted waters. Let's face it, if I'm chasing after somebody and the waters part for them, I'm leaving them alone. That's what my mind tells me. Because you know what? I'm not just fighting them. I'm fighting some sort of, greater thing here. I'm fighting the elements, okay? Really in acknowledging they were fighting God. But what do these people do? God says he's going to harden their hearts so that they can go in after them. For what purpose? Really, when you go down through the text, for what purpose? So that they could be destroyed. And was God glorified in their destruction? Yes, he was. Because their destruction meant the salvation of his people. And so we see again the hardening is effectual.